In this section of our lecture, we're going to be talking about tissues. This is the last part of this chapter. We've now had an overview of cell types, and now we're getting into tissues. I'm going to go back to a minute to this very initial lecture that we talked about before, and make sure that we know where we're at this point. So now we have talked about cells, and we're moving up to the next structural level, tissues. We've talked about the different parts of the cell and how different cells in our bodies have different structures and organelles depending on their function inside the body. Now in this next level of organization, the tissue level, we're looking at cells that have groups of cells that have a similar structure and function. So now we can take all these different cells in our bodies and we can put them into 4 major groups that are based on their function and what they do inside our body. So even though there's lots of different cells, and we'll see all examples of the many different types of cells in our body as we go through this lecture and in lectures to come up later, there are many different types of cells in our bodies, but all of these cells can be put into 4 large categories that we call tissues. Here are the 4 types of tissue. We have what's called epithelial tissue, there's connective tissue, there's muscle tissue, and then there is nervous tissue. Again, these are the 4 primary types of tissue, so all of the different types of cells in our body can fit into one of these 4 categories here. What I want to do now is to show you a slide of some examples of different tissue types. So on this slide here we have 12 different examples of cells, and these cells fit into those 4 tissue categories. So I want you to stop this recording and you can go ahead and use your book. You've already read this chapter and you've seen these cells and the examples of these different tissue types. You can try it without your book, which I would recommend if you can, but if you can't, go ahead and use your book and look at each of these slides, each of these pictures of the different cell types, and see if you can figure out what type of tissue type they fall under, and then more specifically what cell type they are. So go ahead and do that now. Okay, let's see how you did in figuring out what these are. So what you probably noticed is that each column is basically all of the same tissue type. So column number 1 here, these are all different types of muscle tissue. This column here is connective tissue, and this includes this picture here. We have nervous tissue, and then finally we have on the far side here epithelial tissue. We'll come back to this slide later when we start to talk about each of the connective tissues in turn, and we'll point out which cell is each of the cell types that are listed here under each of the types of tissue. We're going to continue this lecture today talking about epithelial tissue. So here are our epithelial tissue types over here. This far column. This is only 3 of the types. There's more than this that we'll see today. But if you went a little bit farther and tried to figure out what each of these cell types are, you would have found that this one here is what we call simple cuboidal. This one here is pseudo stratified, columnar, and then down here we have simple columnar. You'll notice that each of these names here is made up of two words. The first word is each of the words is telling you something about these cells. The first word is telling you how many layers there are. The second word is telling you the shape of the cells. And this is how we categorize epithelial cells, and I'll show you a little bit more about this in just a minute, but that'll give you a little head start there as we go into this. Some of the characteristics of epithelial tissues. First, where are they found? Body coverings, body linings, and glandular tissue. That's where we find epithelial tissue. So, when you look at somebody, what you're seeing is epithelial tissue. So the skin, the outer layer of our skin, is all epithelial. Epithelial tissue provides this covering, and it's our barrier to the outside world as an organism as a whole. So when we're talking about the cell, we said that the plasma membrane is a barrier for the cell. Epithelial tissue forms that covering that forms this barrier with the outside world. And so we find epithelial lining the outside of our body, but also it's lining the outside of our inside of our body. And that's kind of maybe a hard concept to think about, but inside our body, we have this tube running straight from our mouth clear down to our large intestine, to our anus. We have this tube going through our body. And even though we like to think of that as the inside of our body, it's actually the outside. It's in contact with the outside world. Think of this kind of like, a good example is a donut. So if you have a donut, I like donuts, and you have this donut hole. So if this donut is our body, we have this hole running through our body, but we don't call the donut hole the inside of the donut. This is actually in contact with the outside environment. Everything inside the donut is everything that we have to break that donut open to get to it. So our body's the same way. So our skin would be the outside of this donut, and then our digestive tract is the inside, but it's the outside of the inside. So what this means is that epithelial tissue is going to line our whole digestive tract as well. And we find it, and that's true, it's in our mouth, our esophagus, all of the outside layer of our digestive tract is all going to be epithelial tissue, as well as the respiratory system as well. So anything outside the inside of our body as well. And then the glandular tissue. So any tissue that is producing secretions is going to be epithelial tissue as well. What is the function of epithelial tissue? Protection. So we've talked a little bit about this, is our body covering. So obviously our skin protects all the tissues underneath, has a protective function. Absorption as well. So think about the digestive tract. That outside layer both protects, it's a barrier with the outside world, but also things are absorbed across that layer of cells. Filtration, we see this in the kidneys. And then also secretion, so producing hormones and things that come from glands. This is also part. Some characteristics of epithelial tissue. The cells fit closely together and form sheets, often form sheets. This is very important, and this is true if you think about, again, thinking about your skin. Each of the cells in our skin is in contact with the cells next to it, and they form this sheet. This isn't true of all types of tissues, and we'll see, especially connective tissue, the cells hardly ever are next to each other. There's always space between these cells. But epithelial tissue, you always said you don't have these spaces. And this is important in providing protection. So if we had spaces between the cells in our skin, it'd be very easy for bacteria and things to infiltrate our body and get inside. But by having this very tight junction between the cells, they're not able to get in. The outside of the epithelial tissue is called the apical surface. And then we also have a basement membrane. So all of the epithelial tissue has an apical surface that is in contact with the outside world. And then we have the basement membrane that it sits on top of. Here's another important thing about epithelial tissue. It's avascular. So whenever you see a word that has an A at the beginning, that means no. And vascular means the blood system. So avascular means no blood supply. The last thing to point out here is this idea that epithelial tissue will regenerate easily if it is well nourished. This is very important. Think about your skin. We're constantly losing skin cells, and we want that to regenerate easily. Another example, if you get cut or wounded in some way, you want your epithelial tissue to be able to regenerate. Now let's look at how epithelial tissue is classified. And I have a little chart here I want to show you. So as we saw in that slide where I had all the different cells put on the same slide, I pointed out that each epithelial tissue cell type is made up of a combination of two words. So, first of all, epithelial is classified by the number of layers of cells. And there's basically two possibilities. It's either simple, meaning a single layer, or stratified, meaning many layers. And then second of all, it is classified by the shape of the cell. We have three basic shapes. We have squamous, we have cuboidal, and we have columnar. And that is the way that epithelial tissue is classified. So in other words, we have cells that are called simple squamous. We have cells that are called simple cuboidal. We have simple columnar. We have stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, and stratified columnar. This chart is useful as you go through and learn about the different cell types. It's useful to use in order to write down where each of these types of cells is found in the body. There's a couple here that we're not going to talk about, and that is stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar, because although they do occur in the body, they're very rare, and so we're not going to take the time to talk about them. In their place, however, we're going to add one here called pseudo-stratified columnar. And then there's one more type of tissue, epithelial tissue, that doesn't really fit into any of these categories, and that is called transitional. And we'll mention that as well. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of these cell types. We'll look at simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, talk about where they are and what they do, and then we'll get into the stratified squamous, pseudo-stratified columnar, and transitional. As we talk about each of these cell types, I want you to think a little bit about shape and function. So the connection between anatomy and physiology again. Each of these cell types has a certain shape, and that shape is suited to the function that it is carrying out and where it's found in the body. So we'll try to point that out as we go along. That's something to think about as we move through here. Okay, simple epithelia. First type, simple squamous. So a single layer, so simple meaning a single layer. Simple single layer. Squamous means a flat layer of cells. So we have a single flat layer of cells. This is found lining body cavities, lining the lungs and the capillaries, and those membranes of those areas. So if you think about this is a very thin layer of cells. And you can see it in the picture here. So this is an actual slide of simple epithelial tissue, and this thin little purple line here, those are the cells. This area here, this is an open space, and it's lined by this thin single layer of cells. So why would you want to have this single thin layer of cells? Well, if you think about the function here, we said that we find them in the lungs and the capillaries. So capillaries we'll learn about in the cardiovascular system. You've probably heard about them before, but they're the smallest blood vessels that we have in our body. Lungs, if you think about the lungs, their job is to bring oxygen into the blood. And so what has to happen is when we breathe in, we're taking oxygen into our lungs, but the lungs, that oxygen has to travel through the lungs using the membrane transport principles we've already talked about. So let's draw a little picture here. We've got our lung layer here, And then around the lungs we have these capillaries, and they're going to pick up the oxygen into the blood and take it around the body. So the oxygen has to travel through a layer of the lungs, the simple squamous, then it has to pass into the capillaries here, the capillary tubes. We should represent them by red here. So we'll say this is a capillary tube, and then it's going to enter a red blood cell. From there it can go around the body. So in this case we're trying to absorb this oxygen. Oxygen, remember, it can go through the plasma membrane without any help, so this is just going to be simple diffusion, but it does have to cross these layers of cells. So if we had a really thick layer of epithelial cells here, the harder it is for our body to get that oxygen, because it's going to have to go through either more layers of cells or much thicker cells. And so by having a very thin layer, a single thin layer, we are now able to allow that absorption to happen more easily. So again, the shape of the cells, the anatomy of the cells, equals their physiology. Okay, let's look at the next type. The next type of epithelial is simple cuboidal. Simple meaning a single layer, cuboidal meaning cube-shaped. So we're talking about the shape here. So where are these found? These are found in glands and their ducts, and you can see them here. So this picture here is epithelial tissue. This is simple cuboidal. And if you look, these dark purple spots, those are the nuclei of the cells. And then around that nuclei, you can see the plasma membrane. There's a single epithelial cell. And they line these ducts here. So the cells are all lined up, all right next to each other. I'm kind of drawing a space in between, but there's no spaces in between. So we have this layer, single layer of cells, cuboidal shaped cells, around this opening in the middle. So in the middle here we have an opening. And this is actually a picture of the kidneys. And so remember, so what the kidneys are doing, they're filtering the blood. And so these little cuboidal cells are allowing that blood to be filtered, and the filtrate is ending up inside this cavity in between those cells. It's also found in the ovaries. So in this case, because they are doing filtration, we have these cuboidal shaped cells. The next type, simple columnar. So a single layer of column shaped cells. Again, here's a picture over here, and you can see here's our cell. On this side over here we have the apical surface, and then you can see the dark basement membrane for the cells. Here's the nucleus of the cell, the dark purple part of the cell. So in this case, this is showing the cells of the intestine. So our large intestine, small intestine, the digestive tract is made up of these simple cuboidal cells. So if you think about the function of the digestive tract, what is the function? Well, the function is going to be both secretion. So many of these cells are secreting enzymes. So the digestive tract both wants to digest, but then also don't forget that absorption has to happen as well. So in the case of absorption, remember we had the lungs and the capillaries. We wanted a single layer of thin cells in order for that absorption to happen more easily. Here we still have a single layer of cells so that the nutrients and the molecules in the digestive tract can be absorbed through just a single layer, so it doesn't have to go through a lot of plasma membranes and into the blood. But then at the same time you have to be able to secrete as well, so you need more rough endoplasmic reticulum or ribosomes. You need more material, more area in that cell in order to also to be able to secrete things. So again, the anatomy and physiology are matching up here. I also want you to notice, you can kind of see this kind of fuzzy-like substance on the tips of these cells here. Those are microvilli. And we see this in the cells of the intestine. But whenever you see microvilli, whenever you see these extensions of a cell, it's always related to the surface area. And we'll talk more about this in the We talked about the digestive system, but because these cells want to be able to absorb substances, the larger the surface area of the cell, the more nutrients and more that they can absorb. And so this microvilli, if we were to zoom in here very closely, what you'd see is the cell has these little finger-like projections. Those are the microvilli. That allows for a lot more surface area for the nutrients to be absorbed. Okay, those are the types of simple epithelial. We'll now look at the stratified epithelial. Okay, the first one is stratified squamous. Stratified means many layers. Squamous, again, means the flattened cells. So you can see here we have many layers of very, very flat cells. Here's a picture. Again, you can see the nuclei in here, these purple dots, and then you can see the little plasma membrane, all these layers of very squished cells. Down here we have our basement membrane of our epithelial tissue. Down here is connective tissues. This is a picture of the skin. In the next chapter we'll look at this in more detail, but our skin is made up of an epithelial layer of stratified squamous and then a connective tissue layer down below that. So why would we want to have many layers of flattened cells on our skin? If you look at some other places, the skin, the mouth, the esophagus, and other places, the lining of the vagina are all stratified squamous cells. Well, it comes down to this idea of friction. And you're probably familiar with the fact that we're constantly losing skin cells. So if we just had let's say we just had a single layer of squamous cells, we wouldn't have very much to lose. So you'd bump yourself against the door as you walk through the door, and suddenly you'd be bleeding. So in order to protect ourselves, we have these many layers. So we can lose layers of skin, and we're so okay because we have all these layers down below. And we're constantly losing skin. Just putting on clothes and having those clothes rubbed against your body will slough off skin cells. And so we need all these extra cells in order so that we can lose some. Same thing with the mouth. So as you're chewing food, you can lose all these cells, and it's going to be okay because you have a bunch underneath. So again, anatomy and physiology connected together there. This is transitional epithelial. So transitional is a special type of stratified epithelial, and the reason it's called transitional is because it has the ability to stretch. And this is found only in the organs of the urinary system, for example in the bladder. So our bladder has a certain size, but as that bladder fills up with urine, it can double, almost even triple in size and still be intact. And so these cells here, they're all stacked on top of each other, but as that bladder starts to fill, they'll flatten out. So here they look kind of cuboidal. As more and more urine comes in there, they're going to flatten out into very thin cells, and so it allows these cells to expand. So that's just the job of the transitional epithelial. The last epithelial type to point out here is pseudostratified columnar, and also recognize here that it says ciliated as well. So we know what stratified means. It means many layers. What does pseudo mean? Well, pseudo means fake or not really. So basically what we have here is we have not really stratified cells, and they're columnar. And so what that means is that these cells look like they have many layers, but it's actually just one layer of cells. And you can see in this picture here, so here's a cell. It extends clear from the bottom to the top. Here's our basement membrane. And so it looks like, because all these nuclei are at different levels, it looks like we have many layers of cells, but notice that each cell extends clear from the bottom to the top of this layer. And the reason the nuclei are what make it look like there's many layers. If we come back here and compare this to columnar, notice how the columnar, the nuclei are all lined up next to each other on the bottom. But when we look at pseudostratified columnar, the nuclei are at different heights, and so it's misleading there. Sometimes they can be ciliated. We didn't talk about cilia. I should have mentioned cilia when we talked about cells, but cilia are hair-like projections that come off of cells. The flagella, which is like a tail, is similar to cilia, but cilia are much shorter and there's a lot more of them. So they look like little hairs. Different than microvilli. Microvilli are actual extensions, finger-like extensions of the cell, whereas the cilia are proteins that stick out from the top of the cell, just like the hair on the top of your head. And their job is for movement, not necessarily the movement of the cell, but movement of fluid around those cells. And so in our respiratory tract, we have these ciliated cells, and what they do is they move along mucus. So they excrete mucus, and this mucus catches the foreign particles we don't want in our respiratory tract, and then these cilia will beat and create this current to move those particles up into your throat, and at that point you can get rid of them. I'll put a clip up on web study that shows the cilia in action and their job there. Okay, so now we've looked at all the different types of epithelial tissue. The last thing to point out here is the glandular epithelial. There's two major types of glands. There's what we call endocrine glands and exocrine glands, and these are formed by epithelial tissue. Let's start with exocrine glands, even though it's down below. Remember previously in this lecture we talked about exocytosis, exo meaning out. Exocrine has the same base here, so exo meaning out. So it's a gland, and what it's doing is emptying to the surface of the epithelial tissue. So exocrine glands are glands such as sweat glands or the oil glands that are secreting to the outside of the epithelial tissue, onto your skin. So we call those exocrine glands. We also have endocrine glands. So this is like endocytosis, meaning in. So endocrine glands are also producing secretions, but these secretions are being put straight into the blood, and so they're not leaving the body. And so we call these endocrine glands. And these are the glands that produce hormones and are going to be part of the endocrine system, and that's where we get the name for the endocrine system, is from these endocrine glands that produce hormones in that system. And so that is an overview of the epithelial tissue. Next we'll look at connective tissue, and then at the nervous tissue and muscular tissue.